65. The founding of a German empire and the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. The major European powers had long enhanced their own strategic positions by keeping Germany divided into small, weak states that could never have much influence in diplomacy, warfare, or the expanding global economy. To play upon the divisions among the Germans, keeping them in rivalry with each other and dependent upon outside powers, had been the policy of France ever since the Reformation, and of Russia since it entered into the affairs of Europe. To keep the Germanic world divided was in fact a kind of negative prerequisite to the development of early modern European history as we know it. For without it, the economic and cultural leadership of Europe would hardly have become concentrated along the Atlantic seaboard. Nor would a great military empire have arisen in Russia and spread along the Baltic and into Poland. 999 gradually, as we have seen, the Germans became dissatisfied with their weak, fragmented position. They became increasingly nationalistic during and after the 556 Napoleonic Wars. Many German thinkers held that Germany was different from both Western and Eastern Europe, destined someday to work out its own distinctive German way of life and political system. The Germans felt immeasurably superior to the Slavic peoples and cultures. German philosophy, as shown most clearly in Hegel, took on a certain characteristic tone. It tended to criticize modern individualism and to skip lightly over liberal conceptions of individual liberty. It also tended to glorify the state, the nation, and group loyalties. It emphasized the progressive evolution of history, which in the thought of Hegel, and after him Marx, became a vast impersonal force that was moving in clear directions and almost independent of human beings or human will. History was often said to ordain, require, condemn, justify, or excuse. What one didn't like could be dismissed as a mere historical phase, opening into a quite different and more attractive future. What one wanted, in the present or future, could be described as historically necessary and bound to come. The German states ere 1848. In 1848, a series of revolutions had unseated the several governments of Germany. At the Frankfurt Assembly, a group composed essentially of private citizens had tried to organize a united Germany by constitutional methods. They failed because they had no power. Hence, after 1848, the Germans began to think in terms of power and to seek new methods for achieving national unity, though most Germans were also still attached emotionally to their various regional states. What happened in Italy, a revolutionary destruction of all the old governments except that of Piedmont, could not readily happen in Germany. After the failures of the 1848 revolution, the old German states were restored. Austria and Prussia, the kingdoms of Hanover, Saxony, Bavaria, and Württemberg, together with about 30 other states, ranging in size 1,000 down to the free cities of Hamburg and Frankfurt. The loose confederation of 1815, linking all these states together, was restored also, see map P 561. But within this framework, great economic and social changes were occurring. Between 1850 and 1870, the output of both coal and iron in Germany multiplied sixfold. In 1850, Germany produced less iron than France. In 1870, more. Germany was rapidly gaining economic unity and overcoming the economic and social lag that had separated Germans from the fast-developing industrial and global commerce in northwestern Europe. The German cities were growing, bound together by railroad and telegraph, and requiring larger supporting areas to sustain their urban populations. Industrial capitalists and industrial workers were becoming more numerous. With the advantages of unity more obvious than ever, with the ideals of 1848 badly compromised, with a strong philosophical respect for the state and for power, and with a philosophical habit of accepting the successful event as the judgment of history, the Germans were ripe for what happened. They did not unify themselves by their own exertions. They fell into the arms of Prussia. Advantages of unity. Prussia in the 1860s. Bismarck-Prussia had always been the smallest and most precarious of the early modern great powers. Ruined by Napoleon, it had risen again. It owed its international influence and internal character to its army. Actually, it had fought fewer wars than other great powers, but its army enabled Prussia to expand by conquest or diplomacy. The taking of Silesia in 1740 by force, The acquisition of parts of Poland in the partitions of the 1770s and 1790s, and the addition of the Rhineland in 1815 by diplomatic or international 557 agreement were the highlights of Prussian growth. After 1850, those who controlled the destinies of Prussia were apprehensive. Their state had been shaken by revolution. In the Crimean War and at the Congress of 1001 Paris, they were hardly more than spectators. It seemed as if the hard-won and still relatively recent position of Prussia might be waning. Since 1815, the population of Prussia had grown from 11 to 18 million, but the size of the army had not changed. Merely to enforce existing principles of conscription would therefore almost double the army. But this would require increased financial appropriations. After 1850, Prussia had a parliament. It was a parliament, to be sure, dominated by men of wealth, but some of the wealthy Prussians, notably the industrialists of the Rhineland, were liberals who wished the parliament to have control over government policies. These men did not like professional armies and considered the Prussian Junkers, from whom the officer corps was recruited, as their main rivals in the state. The parliament refused the necessary military appropriations. The king at this juncture, in 1862, appointed a new chief minister, Otto von Bismarck. Parliamentary politics. Bismarck was a Junker from Old Brandenburg east of the Elbe. He cultivated the gruff manner of an honest country squire, though he was intellectually superior to the rather unsophisticated landlord class from which he sprang, and for which he often felt an impatient contempt. He shared in many Junker ideas. He advocated, and even felt, a kind of stout Protestant piety. Although he cared for the world's opinion, it never deterred him in his actions. Criticism and denunciation left him untouched. He was not a nationalist. He did not look upon all Germany as his fatherland. He was a Prussian. His social affinities, as with the Junkers generally, lay to the east with corresponding landowning elements of the Baltic provinces and Russia. Western Europe, including most of Germany, he neither understood nor trusted. It seemed to him revolutionary, free-thinking, and materialistic. Parliamentary bodies he considered ignorant and irresponsible as organs of government. Individual liberty seemed to him disorderly selfishness. Liberalism, democracy, and socialism were repugnant to him. He preferred to stress 1002 duty, service, order, and the fear of God. The idea of forming a new German union developed only gradually in his mind and then as an adjunct to the strengthening of Prussia. Bismarck thus had his predilections and even his principles, but no principle bound him, no ideology seemed to him an end in itself. He became the classic practitioner of realpolitik. First he made wars, then he insisted upon peace. Enmities and alliances were to him only matters of passing convenience. The enemy of today might be the friend of tomorrow. Far from planning out a long train of events, then following it step by step to a grand consummation, he seems to have been practical and opportunistic, taking advantage of situations as they emerged and prepared to act in several different directions as events might suggest. In 1862, as minister-president, he set out to thwart the liberals in the Prussian parliament. For 4 years, from 1862 to 1866, Bismarck waged this constitutional struggle. The parliament refused to vote the proposed taxes. The government collected them anyway. The taxpayers paid them without protest. It was the orderly thing to do, and the collectors represented public authority. The limitations of Prussian liberalism, the docility of the population, the respect for officialdom, the belief that the king and his ministers were wiser than the elected deputies, all clearly revealed themselves in this triumph of military policy over the theory of government by consent. The army was enlarged, reorganized, retrained, and re-equipped. Bismarck fended off the showers of abuse from the liberal majority in the 558 chamber. The liberals declared that the government's policy was flagrantly unconstitutional. The Constitution, said Bismarck, could not have been meant to undermine the state. The government, said the liberals, was itself undermining Prussia, for the rest of Germany hoped to find in Prussia, as Italy had found in Piedmont, a model of political freedom. What the Germans admired in Prussia, replied Bismarck coldly, was not 1003 its liberalism, but its power. He declared that the Prussian boundaries as set in 1815 were unsound, that Prussia must be prepared to seize favorable opportunities for further growth. And he added one of his most memorable utterances: "Not by speeches and majority votes are the great questions of the day decided. That was the great error of 1848 and 1849, but by blood and iron." Constitutional struggle. Otto von Bismarck's pragmatic use of power and his successful campaign to create a unified German nation-state made him the most successful practitioner of realpolitik in late 19th century Europe. This photograph suggests the talent for well-focused observation that enabled Bismarck to see clearly what was at stake in the political and diplomatic conflicts of his generation. Hulton Archive. Getty Images. Bismarck's Wars, the creation of the North German Confederation, 1867. A favorable opportunity for Prussian expansion soon emerged. The Danes, engaged in a process of national consolidation of their own, wished to make the Duchy of Schleswig an integral part of Denmark. The population of Schleswig was part Dane and part German. The Diet of the German Confederation, unwilling to see Germans thus annexed outright to Denmark, called for an all-German war upon the Danes. Bismarck had no desire to support or strengthen the existing German Confederation. He wanted not an all-German war, but a Prussian war. To disguise his aims, he acted jointly with Austria, a fellow member of the German Confederation. 1004, in 1864, Prussia and Austria together went to war with Denmark, which they soon defeated. It was Bismarck's intention to annex both Schleswig and the Duchy of Holstein to Prussia, gaining whatever other advantages might present themselves from future trouble with Austria. He arranged a provisional occupation of Schleswig by Prussia and of Holstein by Austria. Disputes soon arose over the kinds of policing problems that commonly afflict occupying forces. Bismarck now proceeded to discredit and isolate Austria. Other European powers were preoccupied with their own domestic issues and not much concerned with Austrian interests in a regional territorial dispute. So Bismarck used strategic diplomatic negotiations to ensure that no foreign state would ally itself with Austria or intervene in German affairs. To weaken Austria within Germany, Bismarck presented himself as a Democrat. He proposed a reform of the German Confederation, recommending that it have a popular chamber 559 elected by universal male suffrage. He calculated that the mass of the German people were wedded neither to the well-to-do capitalistic liberals, nor to the existing government structures of the German states, nor to the House of Habsburg. He would use democracy to undermine all established interests that stood in his way. Bismarck as Democrat. Meanwhile, the occupying powers continued to quarrel over Schleswig-Holstein. Austria finally raised the matter formally in the German Federal Diet, one of whose functions was to prevent war between its members. Bismarck declared that the Diet had no authority, accused the Austrians of aggression, and ordered the Prussian army to enter Holstein. The Austrians called for an all-German force to be sent against Prussia. The result was that Prussia in 1866 was at war not only with Austria, but also with most of the other German states. The Prussian army soon proved its superiority, trained to an unprecedented precision, equipped with the new needle gun, by which the infantryman could deliver 5 rounds a 1,005 minute, brought into the zone of combat by an imaginative use of the new railroads, and skillfully commanded. The Prussian army overwhelmed the Austrians and defeated the other German states soon thereafter. The Austro-Prussian, or 7 Weeks' War, was amazing in its brevity. Bismarck hastened to make peace before the other European powers could realize what had happened. 7 Weeks' War, Prussia annexed outright, together with Schleswig-Holstein, the whole kingdom of Hanover, the duchies of Nassau and Hesse-Kassel, and the free city of Frankfurt. Here the old government simply disappeared before the acts of the Red Reactionary. The German Federal Union disappeared likewise. In its place, in 1867, Bismarck organized a North German Confederation, in which the newly enlarged Prussia joined with 21 other states, all of which combined it greatly outweighed. The German states south of the River Main, Austria, Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, and Hesse-Darmstadt, remained outside the new organization, with no kind of union among themselves. For the North German Confederation, Bismarck produced a constitution. The new structure, though a federal one, was much stronger than the now defunct Confederation of 1815. The King of Prussia became its hereditary head. Ministers were responsible to him. There was a parliament with two chambers. The upper chamber, as in the United States, represented the states as such, though not equally. The lower chamber, or Reichstag, was deemed to represent the people and was elected by universal male suffrage. Such flirting with democracy seemed madness to both conservative junker and liberal bourgeois. It was indeed a bold step, for only France at the time exemplified universal male suffrage in Europe on a large scale, and in the France of Napoleon III, neither old-fashioned conservatives nor genuine liberals could take much satisfaction. As for Great Britain, where voting rights were extended in the same year, 1867, they were still given to fewer than half the adult male population. Bismarck sensed in the masses an ally of strong government 1006 against private interests. He negotiated even with the socialists, who had arisen with the industrialization of the past decade, and who, in Germany at this time, were mainly followers of Ferdinand Lassalle. The Lassallean socialists, unlike the Marxian, believed it possible to improve working-class conditions through the action of existing governments. To the great annoyance of Marx, then in England, the majority of the German socialists reached an understanding with Bismarck. In return for a democratic suffrage, they agreed to accept the North German Confederation. Bismarck, for his part, by making use of democratic and socialist sentiment, won popular approval for his emerging empire. A new constitution 5560-1007, the German Question, 1815 to 1871. From 1815 to 1866, there were 39 German states joined in the German Confederation. The largest states are shown here. The movement to create a unified Germany gave rise in this era to opposing nationalist groups, the Great Germans, who favored an all-German union that would include Austria, and the Little Germans, who were willing to exclude Austria and its empire from a new German nation-state. Bismarck was a Little German, but a Great Prussian. He, 1. Enlarged Prussia by conquest in 1866. 2. Joined Mecklenburg, Saxony, and other regions with Prussia in the North German Confederation of 1867. And 3. Combined this confederation with Bavaria, Württemberg, and other southern states to form the German Empire in 1871. He also, 4. Conquered Alsace-Lorraine from France, and excluded Austria from the new German Empire. These boundaries remained unchanged until 1918. 561. The Franco-Prussian War. The creation of the North German Federation greatly expanded Prussia's political influence, but the situation was not yet stable. The small South German states were left floating in empty space. They would sooner or later have to gravitate into some orbit or another, whether Austrian, Prussian, or French. In France, there were angry criticisms of Napoleon III's foreign policy. France had sent troops to Mexico during the early 1860s and, with the collaboration of Mexican monarchists, had managed to place Napoleon's own chosen ruler, an Austrian archduke named Maximilian, on a precarious Mexican imperial throne. But this French-style empire lacked broad support, and a popular Republican movement overthrew Maximilian's regime in 1867, soon after Napoleon III withdrew his military forces. Maximilian was executed, and the whole Mexican intervention became a transatlantic imperial fiasco. Meanwhile, a united Italy had been allowed to rise on France's borders. And now, contrary to all principles of French national interest observed by French governments for hundreds of years, a strong and independent power was being allowed to spread over virtually the whole of Germany. Everywhere, people began to feel that war was inevitable between France and Prussia. Bismarck played on the fears of France among the leaders and populations in the 1008 South German states. South Germany, though in former times often a willing satellite of France, was now sufficiently nationalistic to consider such subservience to a foreign people disgraceful. To Bismarck, it seemed that a war between Prussia and France would frighten the small South German states into a union with Prussia, leaving only Austria outside, which was what he wanted. To Napoleon III, or at least to some of his advisors, it seemed that such a war, if successful, would restore public approval of the Bonapartist empire. The leaders of both Prussia and France were thus drawn toward war as a solution for various internal problems. Meanwhile, in a totally unexpected chain of events, a revolution in Spain had driven the reigning queen into exile, and a Spanish provisional government invited Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern, a cousin of the King of Prussia, to be constitutional king of Spain. Installing a member of the Prussian royal family as the head of government in Spain would clearly provoke strong opposition from France. 3 times the Hohenzollern family refused the Spanish offer. Bismarck, who could not control such family decisions, but who foresaw the possibility of a usable incident, deviously persuaded the Spanish to issue the invitation, still a 4th time. On July 2, 1870, Paris heard that Prince Leopold had accepted. The French ambassador to Prussia, Benedetti, at the direction of his government, met the King of Prussia at the bathing resort of Ems, where he formally demanded that Prince Leopold's acceptance be withdrawn. It was withdrawn, and the French seemed to have their way. Bismarck was disappointed. France thwarts new Spanish king threats. The French government now went still further. It instructed Benedetti to approach the king again at Ems and demand that at no time in the future would any Hohenzollern ever become a candidate for the Spanish throne. The king politely declined any such commitment and telegraphed a full report of the conversation to Bismarck at Berlin. Bismarck, receiving the telegram, which became famous as the Ems Dispatch, saw 1009A new opportunity, as he put it, to wave a red flag before the Gallic bull. He condensed the Ems telegram for publication, so reducing and abridging it, that it seemed to newspaper readers as if a curt exchange had occurred at Ems, in which the Prussians believed that their king had been insulted, and the French believed that their ambassador had been snubbed. In both countries, the war party demanded satisfaction. On July 19, 1870, on these trivial grounds, and with the ostensible issue of the Spanish throne already settled, the 562 irresponsible and decaying government of Napoleon III declared war on Prussia. The French suffered a crushing defeat at Sedan in northeastern France during the brief Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Napoleon III was captured along with much of his army. French civilians fled from both the battle and advancing Prussian troops, as can be seen in this German engraving of terrified people crossing a dangerous, crowded bridge. DEAG, Dagli Orti, Getty Images. France's military isolation and 10-10. Again, the war was short. Again, Bismarck had taken care to isolate his enemy in advance. The British generally viewed France as wrong to launch the war, and they had already been alarmed by the French operations in Mexico, which suggested an ambition to recreate a French-American empire. The Italians had long been awaiting the chance to seize Rome. They did so in 1870, when the French withdrew their troops from Rome for use against Prussia. The Russians had been awaiting the chance to upset a clause of the Peace of 1856 that forbade them to keep naval vessels in the Black Sea. They did so in 1870. The War of 1870, like the others of the time, failed to become a general European struggle. Prussia was supported by the South German states. France had no allies. The French army proved to be technically backward compared with the Prussian. War began on July 19th. On September 2nd, after the Battle of Sedan, the principal French army surrendered to the Germans. Napoleon III was himself taken prisoner. On September 4th, an insurrection in Paris proclaimed the Third Republic. The Prussian and German forces moved into France and laid siege to the capital. Though the French armies dissolved, Paris refused to capitulate. For 4 months, it was surrounded and besieged. 563. The German Empire, 1871. With their guns encircling Paris, the German rulers or their representatives assembled at Versailles. The chateau and gardens of Versailles, since Louis XVI's unceremonious departure in October 1789, had been little more than a vacant monument to a society long since dead. Here, in the most sumptuous room of the palace, the resplendent Hall of Mirrors, where the Sun King had once received the deferential approaches of German princes, Bismarck, on January 18, 1871, arranged for the German Empire to be proclaimed. The King of Prussia received the hereditary title of German Emperor. The other German rulers, excepting, to be sure, the ruler of Austria and those whom Bismarck had himself dethroned, accepted his imperial authority. 10 days later, the 1,011 people of Paris, shivering, hungry, and helpless, opened their gates to the enemy. France had no government with which Bismarck could make peace. It was not at all clear what kind of government the country wanted. Bismarck insisted on the election of a French constituent assembly by universal suffrage. He demanded that France pay the German Empire a war indemnity of 5 billion gold francs, then an enormous and unprecedented sum, and cede to it the border region of Alsace and most of Lorraine. Though most Alsatians spoke German, most of them also felt themselves to be French, having shared in the general history of France since the 17th century. There was strong local protest at the transfer to Germany. Thousands of Alsatians moved to other places within the new French Republic or to Algeria, and the French never reconciled themselves to this cold-blooded amputation of their frontier. The peace dictated by Bismarck was embodied in the Treaty of Frankfurt of May 10, 1871. Thereafter, as will be seen, the French Constituent Assembly gradually proceeded to construct the Third Republic. Bismarck's demands. The consolidation of Germany transformed the face of Europe. It reversed the dictum not only of the Peace of Vienna, but even of the Peace of Westphalia. The German Empire, no sooner born, was the strongest state on the continent of Europe. Rapidly industrialized after 1870, it became more potent still. Bismarck had astutely exploited the conflicting ambitions of other European states and used 3 short wars to bring about a German unification that most European governments had long sought at all costs to prevent. He outwitted everybody in turn, including the Germans. The united all-German state that issued from the nationalist movement was a Germany conquered by Prussia. Within the new empire, Prussia directly controlled about 2/3 of the whole imperial territory. Before such answerable success, the Prussian liberals capitulated, and the Prussian parliament passed an indemnity act. The gist of it was that Bismarck admitted to a certain high-handedness during the constitutional struggle, but that the parliament legalized the disputed tax. 1012 collections ex post facto, agreeing to forgive and forget in view of the victory over Austria and its consequences. Thus, liberalism gave way to a triumphant nationalism, the strength of the German state. The German Empire received substantially the earlier constitution of the North German Confederation. It was a federation of monarchies, each based in theory on divine or hereditary right. At the same time, in the Reichstag, elected by universal male suffrage, the empire rested on a kind of mass appeal and was in a sense democratic. Yet, the country's ministers were responsible to the emperor and not to the elected chamber. Moreover, it was the rulers who joined their territories to the empire, not the people's. There were no popular plebiscites as in Italy. Each state kept its own laws, government, and constitution. The people of Prussia, for example, remained for Prussian affairs under the rather illiberal Constitution of 1850, with its 3-class system of voting. In affairs of the Reich, 564 or Empire, however, they enjoyed an equal vote by universal suffrage. The emperor, who was also the king of Prussia, had legal control over the foreign and military policy of the empire. The German Empire, in effect, served as a mechanism to magnify the role of Prussia, the Prussian army, and the East Elbian Prussian aristocracy in world affairs. 1013, the new German Empire was officially proclaimed in January 1871 at the historic French palace in Versailles. King Wilhelm of Prussia became the German emperor. This painting by Anton von Werner shows how Bismarck assembled military officers and representatives from all of the constituent German states in the famous Hall of Mirrors, a symbolic site of past French grandeur that made the German celebration all the more humiliating for the French. Ullstein Bild DTL, Getty Images. The Habsburg Empire ere 1848, Bismarck united Germany, but he also divided it, for he left about 1/6 of the Central European Germans outside his German Empire. These Germans of Austria and Bohemia had now to work out a common future with the dozen other nationalities in the Danubian domain. The clumsiness and limitations of the old Habsburg multinational empire are clear enough, but more impressive is its astonishing capacity to survive the recurring upheavals in Central European societies. Having survived repeated attempts to dismember it during the 18th century, the Napoleonic Wars, and then the revolutions of 1848, the empire held together until the cataclysm of the First World War. But the events of the 1850s and 1860s greatly altered its character. 11014 Habsburg Resilience 565. The essential question in a nationalist age was how the Habsburg government would adapt to the challenges that emerged from the expanding campaigns for national self-expression. By Habsburg in this period, one means primarily Francis Joseph, who as emperor from 1848 to 1916 reigned even longer than his famous contemporary, Queen Victoria. Francis Joseph, like many others, could never shake off his own tradition. Buffeted unmercifully by the waves of change and by Central European nationalisms, he cordially disliked everything liberal, progressive, or modern. Personally, Francis Joseph was incapable of enlarged views, ambitious projects, bold decisions, or persevering action. And he lived in a pompous dream world, surrounded in the imperial court by great noblemen, high churchmen, and bespangled personages of the army. Yet the government was not idle. It was, if anything, too fertile in devising new deals and new dispensations. Various expedients were tried after 1849, but none was tried long enough to see if it would work. For several years, the ruling idea was centralization, to govern the empire through the German language and through efficient, Vienna-based bureaucratic systems. The abolition of serfdom, as accomplished in 1848, would become permanent for all parts of the empire. This policy required strong official control over landlords to work in practice, and there would be more government support for the building of railroads and other forms of material progress. This Germanic and bureaucratic centralization was distasteful to the non-German nationalities, and especially to the Magyars. It is important to say Magyars, not Hungarians, because the Magyars composed less than half of the very mixed population within the then existing borders of Hungary. Nevertheless, the Magyars, as the strongest of the non-German groups, and hence the most able to maintain a political system of their own, felt the Germanic influence as most oppressive. 10-1-15 German language and centralization. The Compromise of 1867. In 1867, a compromise was worked out between the Germans of Austria-Bohemia and the Magyars of Hungary. It worked to the common disadvantage of the Slavs, who were viewed as a backward, less civilized people by both the Germans and the Magyars. The compromise created a dual monarchy of a kind unparalleled in Europe. West of the river Leith was the Empire of Austria. East of it was the Kingdom of Hungary. The two were now judged exactly equal. Each had its own constitution and its own parliament, to which the governing ministry in each country was henceforth to be responsible. The administrative language of Austria would be German, of Hungary, Magyar. Neither state could intervene in the other's affairs. The two countries were joined by the fact that the same Habsburg ruler should always be emperor in Austria and king in Hungary. Yet the union was not personal only, for though there was no common parliament, delegates of the two parliaments were to meet together alternately in Vienna and Budapest, and there was to be a common ministry for finance, foreign affairs, and war. To this common ministry of Austria-Hungary, both Austrians and Hungarians were to be appointed, a dual monarchy. Both Austria and Hungary, under the dual monarchy, were in form constitutional parliamentary states, but neither was democratic. In Austria, after much juggling with voting systems, a true universal male suffrage was instituted in 1907. In Hungary, when the First World War came in 1914, still only a quarter of the adult male population had the vote. Socially, the Great Reform of 1848, the abolition of serfdom, was not allowed to move toward more upsetting political or economic conclusions. The owners of great landed estates, especially in Hungary, 110-16, but also in parts of the Austrian Empire, remained the unquestionably dominant class. They were surrounded by landless peasants, an agrarian proletariat, 566 composed partly of lower classes of their own nationality and partly of other peasant peoples, like the Slovaks and Serbs, who in this era lacked an educated or wealthy class of their own. National and social questions therefore came together. For some nationalities, especially the Magyars, a social and economic ascendancy was entangled with a national ascendancy. Landlordism became the basic social issue. A landowning class, increasingly educated in the knowledge and organizational methods of modern European cultures, faced a depressed peasant mass that was generally left out of the advancing civilization of the day. National and social questions. Hungary and Austria formed a political union under a dual monarchy and common government ministries after 1867, but most of the population continued to live a traditional agrarian life. This painting by the Hungarian artist Miklos Barabás, The Arrival of the Bride, 1856, portrays one of the enduring rituals of rural societies, which were often romanticized in 19th century nationalism.